There we go. Share the screen. Good to be with you, my friends. There it is. It loves to be difficult some days. Decided to be halfway nice today. We'll take it. Good to be with you. Let's see if I can move. There we go. Good to be with you. So last time, just to jump straight in, we looked at the flood and the crisis it created in the heart of God, as that's how Brueggemann saw it. And that's actually, I would agree with that his reading hits close to the text. I saw some other people saying roughly the same thing, because it's really almost all of the commentary about the flood comes with God saying in God's heart something, here's what this means, here's what we're going to do with it. There's also then God's choice to never again destroy creation, which we all appreciate, but also means there's a choice, an implicit choice to invest, to care, and to nurture creation in new ways, right? If you're not going to sort of stand back and watch it happen and things get messed up, this time you have to be a little bit more involved. You don't have to, you're not going to just let it run amok and create problems without trying to at least do something about it along the way. Anyway, so that's where we concluded. Abraham worshiped the Lord. The Lord was happy with that fragrant offering. And so now this is where we start today. Noah's sons who went out of the ark were Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Now Ham is the father of Canaan. These three were Noah's sons, and from these were scattered abroad all the earth folk. Now Noah was the first man of the soil. He planted a vineyard. And when he drank from the wine, he became drunk and exposed himself in the middle of his tent. Ham, the father of Canaan, saw his father's nakedness and told his two brothers outside. Then Shem and Japheth took a cloak. They put it on the shoulders of the two of them and walked backward to cover their father's nakedness. Their faces were turned backward. Their father's nakedness they did not see. Now, when Noah awoke from his wine, it became known to him what his littlest son had done to him. So he said, "Damned be Canaan. Servant of servants may he be to his brothers." And he said, "Blessed be the Lord, God of Shem, but may Canaan be servant to them. May God extend Japheth. Let him dwell in the tents of Shem, but may Canaan be servant to them." And Noah lived after the deluge 350 years. All the days of Noah were 900 years and 50 years. Then he died. All right, so obviously here's the conclusion of the Noah narrative, which shows us several things, right? First, despite all the destruction and death that we just witnessed, God wielding over the earth in the flood, well, evil continues, right? Bad things almost immediately happen with Noah and his sons. It has not done the work that God hoped it would, which is to set things right and make everyone better. Literally, the first action after worshiping God is to mess it all up somehow, some way. So you have the three sons of Noah, Shem. Japheth is how he translates it in the Schocken Bible. It's Japheth is how you usually see it in most English translations. And then Ham, who is clearly Canaan, but they interchange those words pretty often there, right? As they're telling the story about Ham, he's also Canaan, mainly because that's who his children become. Now, this is one of my favorite quotes from Brueggemann. "It is clear that the means of a family narrative is used to characterize political realities at some point in Israel's history." That is, they're telling this family story to prove why Canaan's the bad guy, right? Why Israel is at odds with Canaan, but they're okay, and then the Canaanites or the Hamites or whatever group it might be, but they happen to be okay with Japheth's family, right? Who might well be the Philistines. It's not clear, but more than a few commentators talk about how they're probably the Philistines, and why the Israelites are okay with those Philistines, but they're not okay with the Canaanites, right? Why are they not okay? Well, because he did something bad. we don't exactly know what Ham did. That is not in the text, right? It's just not there. Whoever claims they know what happened to Noah between Noah and Ham isn't really being honest, because it just says they saw his nakedness or uncovered his nakedness, but there's no clarity on what occurred, right? But we can say it's clearly bad because Noah gets hot. His brothers are very distressed and go through a lot of work to make sure they don't see their father in that way. So there's something about it that's clearly not what should have happened. Brueggemann understands the uncovering nakedness as some sort of sexual act. Other commentators I read sort of go back and forth. Others say, maybe, maybe not. Maybe it's just more euphemism for seeing him in an extremely weakened state or something along those lines. Again, what we can say is it's unequivocally unclear how it's been interpreted historically. It's almost universally been interpreted historically as a sexual act, right? It could be because uncovering the nakedness of your father in Leviticus often refers to actually Noah's wife. To say you would uncover the nakedness of your parents is to have intercourse with one of the parents in that situation, a son having intercourse with the wife or with the mother. But again, it's not clear. It could be a homosexual act with Noah. I don't know. We could spend a lot of time debating, but it doesn't matter. What's the more important thing is the act is not, it's not consensual. Noah's drunk and passed out, right? We're very clear about him being unable to be a willing participant in whatever the action is. Because it's not listed as what it is, because it does, and they do say things. There's plenty of other times in the Old Testament where they're very explicit about what someone did or didn't do to another person sexually. The lack of clarity here really speaks more to the reality of it should not have been done between. It's more incestual is the bigger issue than necessarily homosexual or a wide variety of other things. That lack of consent, right? It has the intonation of rape or an intonation of something pretty terrible going on. I'll pause there just because that's a heavy kind of topic. I want to see if there's any questions. Again, we don't know a lot. All we can do is judge from the responses that something pretty awful happened, but what that was, we don't know. Okay, so we'll look at the response then. Brueggemann again says the text is not overly concerned with the specific offense of Canaan. It's more concerned with the far-reaching political and theological implications of the act, right? It's more concerned with, because this ancestor of Canaan did this horrible thing, that means the Canaanites are not approved by God, right? Are terrible people, damned be the Canaanites, damned be those people in the land, damned be all of them. This is Israel's land, not Canaan's land. And we were talking just before this, Nettie and I were talking just before this. It sure seems to still have implications today, 4,000 years later, quite frankly, because that's still some of the conversation you will hear more or less in Israel today, right? It's Israeli land. The Canaanites need to leave. They're terrible people. They're horrible people. They bomb things. They blow things up. And the Canaanites on the other side say, no, Israel is terrible people. They do horrible things. They need to get out, right? The debate continues. This is just a moment where, at least in our Bible, we have to wrestle with what the scripture does. But here is that theological justification, Israel's political stance towards Canaan, right? There's others, but this is it. This is the one that starts that sort of conversation. Later, we have the promise between God, the covenant between God and Abraham to give the promised land. But this is why Canaan is not worthy of the land, right? You usually need both to take over someone else's property. So this is part of that conversation. Brueggemann then continues, the prohibitions of sexual violation and indignity embody a rejection of Canaanite ways of life and self-security. Canaan is presented as the concrete expression of an essential disorder which leads to dehumanization even in the post-flood creation. Ooh, There's a mouthful for you. Big old mouthful. I want to pause for just a second and try and translate Brueggemann. Basically, this is one of those things that Israel has long understood itself to be, that it's as much a way of life as it is a confession of faith, right? And the way that you know a faithful Jew is he is someone who does not sexually violate others, right? He or she doesn't models dignity for the other human beings around them and life, right? It has a very different way of being than the tribes, the Canaanites, the Philistines, the Jebusites, all those different groups that are always listed, do not follow the rules of the Lord of Israel. And so therefore, because of that difference, you know who is in the right and who is in the wrong. Canaan is presented expressly disordered because look at Canaan. They have sex with their dads, or they have sex with their moms, or some of those kinds of things. And that's one of those systems that, ironically, Brueggemann's talking about how that leads to dehumanization. And I think he means those sexual acts, those predatory sexual acts, lead to the dehumanization of each other. I think that's accurate, but it also leads then, this can be used as justification to dehumanize the Canaanites, right? Like they're animals, they're evil, they are other, they do these terrible things and we need to get rid of them. But I agree with Brueggemann, but I think he missed the golden opportunity to use the term post-diluvium world. I always love when someone says it's antediluvium or post-diluvium, old Latin terms that you don't hear too much anymore. But that said, I also think this incident was used for politics, but it also just feels sort of like a school ground taunt to a certain degree. Like not just, you can't just say, oh, you don't deserve the land, or we have a better relationship with God, or God said we get the land. This seems much more like, ooh, you're dirty because your dad did this, right? Or your grandpappy did that kind of thing. It's a very snarky, heady little kind of comment that can be used in that debate, that ongoing debate about who has the land, who owns the land, who gets the land, all that kind of stuff. What else do y'all hear or see in these verses? This strange drunken party after the flood.
As you were reading this, the thought that occurred to me is like this was maybe setting up the reason why the Israelites had, centuries later could come in and overrun Canaan or take Canaan.
Oh, it's absolutely what they're doing. Yes.
And so it's just setting the groundwork up for that.
I think that's exactly what it's about. There's no reason to tell the story otherwise.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and for those people whose theology says the flood was a wake-up call for everybody to start living right, they didn't get off to a very good start.
No. Well, I agree with that 100%. And I also think, is there anything more human in the world than that response? Oh, I got a second chance. Oh, I blew that chance. Like almost immediately out of the gate. That was, wow. I went to rehab, everything got better, and then oops, as soon as I got out of rehab and everything settled in, I went right back to what I was doing somehow. Why? Why did I do that?
Yep.
Or as Paul says, why do I do the things I hate and cannot do the things that I am supposed to love, right? The essential nature of being human some days, or a lot of days, quite frankly.
A lot of days for a lot of people, yes.
Oh, for all of us, just to what extreme, right? That's the only real question. It's not, I do not believe that there's any human being that's immune from any of that. Just to what degree?
No matter how much they may think they are.
Right. Absolutely. Any other thoughts on the flood? or the world shortly after the flood. All right, so
I wonder how many of the early stories from the different cultures, so many of them included flood.
yes. Yeah, we talked about that a little last time. They all have, there's almost every Near East culture, whether you're talking about the Sumerians, the Babylonians, the Syrians, the Assyrians, I think even the Egyptians, all of them have flood stories, you know, some sort of memory of a giant flood that was truly terrible and cataclysmic. But the difference is this flood story is much more about how does it change God than it's about how does it change humanity. Because ultimately, as we see, it doesn't change humanity a lick. we get wiped off the face of the earth for being evil, and then we first act or two after we get off the boat, we're right back to doing stupid stuff. It does not change humanity at all that we can see, but it changes God and the way God chooses to deal with creation, which is why, at least, and I haven't read all of them. I have you're welcome to borrow it. Anyone's welcome to borrow it. It's called the Old Testament Parallels, where they have literally got a bunch of those stories, and you can read them with the Noah text. Like here's Gilgamesh in that epic that tells the story of a flood for a very similar kind of story. You can read them. I've read one or two as part of coursework in seminary, but they're all concerned with people and the person and how heroic they are, not with the God or the gods and why it happened in the first place, right? And what it means. All right, so we'll keep going a little bit. So I'm going to skip reading the balance of chapter 10. That's mainly because it's all the genealogies of the sons of Noah, where they settled, who they begat, and there's very little else in there, certainly of any sort of theological interest. It's just, oh, this one had this child had this child, and that son had that son, and that son had that son, and then they settled in the land of Goshen or in Egypt or in Israel or, you know, Palestine or Canaan or whatever. It's really all it is. But we can say that this genealogy and really the story of Ham continued to animate lots of things for millennia. Historically, the taunts of Israel towards Ham and the Canaan continued with slavery. I didn't realize this. I taught this. I did a discussion, 10 years ago probably, on Genesis, and a friend brought up the fact that a great deal of the conversations justifying slavery was to say Ham and Ham/Canaan, his progeny goes to two places. One, they go to Canaan. The other, they go down into Egypt and Africa. And so Hamites then and this is from like 19th, 18th century thinking, they would say, oh, if you are African, then you are of the tribe of Ham, you are a Hamite. And then they would continue this conversation about how, well, you know, Ham did horrible things with his dad. Therefore, that anyone who is from that group has that same curse that God laid on them. I said God, Abraham, God and Noah was also laid on the children of Ham by multiple generations, right? Like, oh, well, you have to be servants to others. So this was literally the justification for slavery for some folks, the preaching and teaching of I don't know what, a good 300-400 years of slavery in America. The Hamites were the Africans captured and put into slavery, and they had to be servants because that's how God/Noah, not Abraham, Noah cursed the children of Ham, right, to be servants of others. It's really weird, but we can see again, politics were used multiple times to treat people poorly, whether that's the Canaanites or Africans. The language and the terms are almost exactly the same. You've got to serve someone else because horrible things your family did or your great whatever grandpappy did. So doesn't change the text. The text does not have that in there that way, but that is definitely how the text has been used and misused, which I always, to be honest, I find that as fascinating sometimes as what the text means, to go like, how did how did someone get to that part, right? How did you twist it to that degree that suddenly it's a justification for intercontinental slave trade, right? Transatlantic trade, slave trade. It's truly amazing, but that was literally part of the justification for taking people out of Egypt was, well, God and Noah cursed them to be servants. They should be used to being servants. That's what it's all intended for. It's all part of God's plan. Yikes. Anything on that side of it? That was a little bit of an excursus, a little side commentary, but I found it fascinating all those years ago. I still find it fascinating now. The other that I didn't mention, of course, if you've ever worried or wondered both, why instead of calling the children of Israel Jews or Semites, it is because of this verse as well, right? The Jews are all children of Shem or Sem, and thus they are the Semites. They're Hamites and Semites and Japhites are the three sort of nations that go out from Abraham. And so whenever anybody says it's anti-Semitic, against the children of Sem, right? And they are the children of Sem. So while this seems like a completely throwaway story and sort of weird and goofy, it's had an amazing impact linguistically and culturally on us without really realizing how or why. It's in a lot of spots for a verse that really is, I think, more about justifying, like you said, Nettie. I think it's much more about justifying a reason to take over the property of the Canaanites and kick them out than it is about anything else. Certainly actual, perhaps fact, who knows? Any other thoughts on Ham, Shem, Semites?
Back to the genealogy for just a quick second. Is this where it's 3 sets of 14 generations, or am I thinking of somewhere else?
That is in the Gospel of Matthew.
That's in Matthew, okay.
Right, where they divide it up and say there was, well, Luke and Matthew both have genealogies, and I always get confused as to which is doing which, but one of those two basically goes, here's the 14 generations from like Adam to Noah or whatever, and then it's Noah to Abraham and Abraham to Jesus or something. You know, they have it divided up.
Okay.
In certain groups like that.
Okay.
I'd have to look at it again, but yeah.
I wondered that, but then I looked at chapter 10 just on my 2 pages, and it looks like more than 3 sets of 14.
Yeah, it's not here. There are 3 sets of genealogies because you sort of get what happens to the children of Ham, what happens to the children of Shem, and what happens to the children of Japheth. But it's more just completely divided up.
Okay.
Like how they spread across the earth, and it's about how with the genealogy of Jesus explaining how this is all part of God's plan, right? And one story.
Okay. Well, I'll save my ponderings about the 3 sets of 14 for another time.
Yeah, different book. All right, so we'll continue with chapter 11, which is the story of Babel. Now, all the earth was of one language and one set of words. And it was when they migrated to the east that they found a valley in the land of Shinar and settled there. They said, each man to his neighbor, come now, let us bake bricks and let us burn them well burnt. So for them, brickstone was like building stone, and raw bitumen was for them like red mortar. Now they said, come now, let us build ourselves a city and a tower, its top in the heavens, and let us make ourselves a name, lest we be scattered over the face of all the earth. But the Lord came down to look over the city and the tower that the humans were building. The Lord said, here, they are one people with one language for them all. And this is merely the first of their doings. Now there will be no barrier for them in all that they scheme to do. Come, now, let us go down, and there let us baffle their language, so that no man will understand the language of his neighbor. So the Lord scattered them from there over the face of all the earth, and they had to stop building the city. Therefore, its name was called Babel, for there the Lord baffled the language of all the earth folk, and from there the Lord scattered them over the face of all the earth. All right, so we can say a couple of things. First, there's some likely historical connections to this story. Israel, if you recall, was taken into captivity by Babylon. They were forced into a march to Babylon, that is the city. And then they most likely heard a million strange languages when they were there, right? I mean, they're in a cosmopolitan capital of the world that's a foreign land, that's not their language, combined with other traders, dealers, like any sort of international capital, you just have people talking in all kinds of different languages. So those experiences then are likely being explained in this story of Babel, right? Like, why did they babble, I guess? If we all come from the same people, what do we do with that, right? Same family, that is, at least. Additionally, the tower was likely a reference to a ziggurat of Babylon, those step pyramids. It was not likely a tower as much as a really steep-sided ziggurat. And it does have the feel of a condemnation of urban life and pride. The key, though, is to show the text shows more nuance and thought on that than these situations, than a simple declaration against towers or Babylon or urban life, right? It's none of it is simple. You can see that pretty quickly because it's a recognition that not everything is going well. Brueggemann then takes a minute and points to a couple of words. One is to say scatter, or in Hebrew, the pus, P-U-S. That's one of the key points of this section. After all, humanity is fearful of being scattered. It literally says, lest we be scattered. Oh, stay together, lest we lose each other. Humanity from our start had to be much more of a herd animal than we are today to survive. And so as a result, humanity is just fearful of being scattered. Then God makes the choice to explicitly gather them because they can't seem to do it themselves. And this is a direct quote from Brueggemann. The idea of scatter/spread abroad, at least in this context, is not negative, but more concerned with punishment. It can be argued that in this context, the intent of creation finally comes to fulfillment. So here's Brueggemann's argument. God commands creation to go forth and multiply, with the idea that spreading out and expanding is part of God's witness and plan, right? The first command that Adam and Eve receive is to go forth and multiply. As well as then to subdue the earth, right? So it all gets caught up in that. The explicit then, so if we understand that God's plan is spreading people out, is sending them out in the world to subdue it, then the explicit refusal of Babel to do that is opposing God's will and plan, right? If God's plan is to go forth and multiply and spread across the face of the earth and subdue it, well, staying together in one little spot and building a tower so everybody remembers you is intentionally opposite of God's plan, right? You couldn't come up with a more opposite conversation. It's not to reach God in the heavens, it's to supplant God as the important person in the room who makes these kinds of choices, right? So therefore, the confusion of language is God's plan to get us to scatter across the face of the earth, right? It's not necessarily about punishment as much as just fulfilling what God's will was already being ordered, right? And then for that matter, if that's how that works, the Babel in that story is all about that, then Pentecost, the moment when the Spirit shares the ability to speak language, is overcoming those differences, right? Is figuring out how to move across the face of the earth and connect with other people. Or, said a little differently, Brueggemann notes that the way God thwarts humanity in building the tower in verse 7 is the word Shema, which could be translated that they do not listen to each other, right? Like, so if you go back to verse 7, the word is Shema, they do not, and they translated understand each other. Shema, though, is the word that is used later. Hear, O Israel, the Lord is your God, right? Shema Israel Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad. Hear, right? Or listen, Israel, listen up. Translating it as understand changes that meaning just enough so that you don't handle it as well. That is, if translated as listen instead of understand, the text may pose a covenantal theological issue. How do we take care of each other if we can't listen to each other? This is a quote from Brueggemann. We may usefully reflect on what it makes possible for persons to listen to each other and what makes listening difficult or impossible. The capacity to listen in ways which transform depends upon trust. The capacity to listen in ways which transform depends upon trust in the speaker, readiness to be impacted, and a willingness to have newness come into one's life. There you go. In other words, Brueggemann notes that this is all about listening. It's certainly about scrambling language and all that kind of stuff, but it's also like a sort of lament for why can't humanity listen to each other, right? That's the sadness of the story of Babel, is we can't seem to listen. We can't speak because of language, but even then we don't listen real well, even if they are trying to speak. Brueggemann notes that the Pentecost narrative then is not as much about the ability to speak different languages as it shows others willing to listen, learn, and change with the gospel message, right? It's not about conversion. Oh, because this man came and talked to us or something changed that afternoon. It's not really that. What it is completely and undoubtedly instead is this willingness to listen and to share the story and to then go out into the world with it, whatever means you have to do that. So on one level, we can say that Pentecost is an undoing of Babel, it's undoing of the conscious and subconscious actions in these first few chapters of Genesis to separate, to segregate, to say this group's better than that group, or those folks can talk nicer to the rabbi or to the priest. But in reality, it's not working. Does that make sense? Is there a question? Probably have not heard that one. I had not heard that until I was reading Brueggemann, but it also makes a lot of sense. No one. Just explained it perfectly, huh?
It sheds new light on the Pentecost narrative.
It does.
I mean, what good is the blathering on in different languages? The key is that they were able to hear and understand.
Yeah, I don't know. Can you say that a different way? Trying to get my head around it.
Well, maybe I'm misremembering something about the.
No, it's okay. Well, just what were you saying?
Just that it's all fine for people to babble and sit around and yap in other languages,
right?
But what good is it, or what's the point of it if it can't be understood?
Right. I think that's a fair assessment. I think that might be more of what they were getting on to in the text than it is necessarily how the text's been treated, which is again a justification to segregate someone who doesn't agree with the stories, or segregate, push them out of community because they don't follow the rules the way you want them to, all that kind of stuff. Well, we went quick today, so I'll be out next week with my family on vacation. Really, and that's just doing nothing, quiet time after we had a great trip to Israel, but I am learning that I need a couple of days off where I do nothing. I don't have to be in charge of anything. So class will be back in 2 weeks, which will be fine. The other reason I went ahead and sort of laid up and stopped here, this ends what's known as the prehistorical period of Genesis. Next comes the story of Abraham and Sarah, and you start the process of having the conversation about the patriarchs and matriarchs and what the faith is beginning to look like, right? Before you have these big events, the flood, creation, Babel, all these big events, but not a lot of sort of personality to it. And even then, not a lot of connective tissue between the people, even within some of those stories. They're all sort of everywhere. So made the most sense to sort of go, well, we'll have a shorter session today, knowing that we'll have lots to talk about. The fall will be fun because they'll all be Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and all their problems, which the nice thing about reading these stories is I don't care how unhealthy your family is, they're still healthier than what's going on in the Bible at the time. With the patriarchs. It's extraordinarily how unhealthy they are.
I'm trying to decide if that makes me feel better or not.
It should. It should. Look, the thing, and I've seen this several times, it goes around every quarter or so on social media that says what's truly amazing about the Old Testament is that Israel did not edit the book, right? They did not edit it for propaganda and just say they're the best guys ever and they've always followed God. Instead, they recorded the fact that they messed up and how they got through it. That's what gives the Bible its power, is not the successes of like, and then we defeated the Jebusites and then we conquered Jerusalem or whatever. I mean, that's great. But the more important thing that we learn is and then they failed miserably and begged for forgiveness and God helped them out and they figured out how to do something a little bit better, right? Because there's everything else horrible that could possibly be done that is horrible is listed. But there's still this sort of work that says, well, but we got to be in a relationship with God. We got to figure out how to make it work, even though we messed it all up again. So it is that cycle of sinfulness, begging for forgiveness, then being forgiven and getting a little bit of hope and then making a stupid choice again, and the cycle repeats, right? But it is important for all of our faith. All right, my friends, anything else for any, really we can do any of these stories. We got a couple of minutes if we want to go back to talk about any of the sort of prehistory or pre-patriarchal narratives. All right, I'll say no, and that's just fine. Well, have a great day, my friends. And yeah, this Sunday, John Porter will be on preaching, and then everybody, we got about 20 different people or more who all said their favorite hymns to sing were Christmas. So we're doing Christmas in July on Sunday. Should be a fun time. All right, my friends, have a great weekend. We'll see you soon.
Thank you, Bill. Have fun at the beach.
Thank you, Bill.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.